All right. It's been too long. Has it been a whole month already? It's Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett, and with my monthly visit on Coast to Coast, I have to make each show count, and so once more, we've packed it, but it'll be totally worth it. Thank you to everybody who's been keeping in touch in the last month. Love to do that through Twitter. Again, at Deacon Punnett, DeaconPunnett, at Deacon Punnett is my Twitter account. So let me give a shout out to Raven and Johnny B and Benny D and A4, Pat Z, IVI, Random Acts of Heroism, Kevin, Russ, JetX, Terry, Robert, Donna, Laureen. The list goes on. It's really fun. I love to keep in touch with you all, and I send out a bunch of tweets today for both some news items that are coming up tonight and the whole show, which we'll get into coming up in just a minute. First, let me tell you that I saw the movie Silent House today, which was an interesting movie. Not just how it was done, fairly low-budget film shot on HD, I think, and then transferred to film in a house in a remote location, guaranteed to make money. This movie is like, it's impossible for this movie to lose money, whereas you see something like John Carter, which opened up this weekend, and it's impossible for that movie to ever make money, it would seem. When the budget was so high that even with a big turnout, and it didn't get it, it would still be suffering at the box office, whereas Silent House was kind of fun to watch, and it's perfect for tonight's topic that we'll get into coming up next hour, and that's Monsters in America, our historical obsession with the hideous and the haunting. We'll get into a broader discussion of what is unique about our American monsters. As I tweeted out earlier, tell me about your monsters, and I will tell you who you are. That's kind of the theme of this book. And there is something about our monsters which is informative about who we are as a people, and you can almost see how all of the major cultural shifts in our country have resulted in a shift in our monsters, be they real or not. And that's another discussion we'll get into coming up next hour on Coast to Coast. Things that are real, that are not a monstrosity, which we turn into the monstrous because it serves our purpose. And other things which we continue to track, thinking someday we may find out whether or not they're real. But in the meantime, they serve our purposes because, well, Americans need our monsters. We'll tell you more about that a little bit later on. But this hour, we are facing what might be another chapter in the book, Monsters in America. There's a couple of stories at coasttocoastam.com I want to bring to your attention coming up next. And one of those is a revisit from something that got posted apparently last night on Coast to Coast AM. The new Phoenix lights. What is going on in Phoenix? What does it mean to us? Coming up next on Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. Okay, so a bunch of personal things here I'll just pass along real quickly, and then I'll get to the news at coasttocoastam.com. First, as I mentioned, I saw the movie Silent House today with my wife, and as I tweeted out earlier, at just the right moment when something went boo up on the screen, I grabbed my wife's knee. It was so great. She jumped about 3 feet. I think it's like, I think that's one of those moments where it takes any kind of actual, whatever is actually happening on the screen, and it just enhances it. I think I was kind of doing her a favor, kind of like the old days of the B horror movies in the 50s, you know, where suddenly, you know, they would have a shock going in the theater seat or something like that. That's all. I was just providing that. But that having been said, it was still atmospherically, it was a really interesting movie, especially in light of our topic tonight. And we'll talk more about Monsters in America coming up. But I also tweeted out a photo yesterday. I was on a body recovery mission. Sadly, somebody that is the brother of a friend had gone missing, and the local authorities believe that he had drowned in the Mississippi. probably intentionally, but nobody knows for sure yet. And so we were walking up and down the shores of an area with our dogs, and we were looking to see whether we could find any clues to his disappearance. And right there, while we were walking along the shores of the Mississippi, come along people who are water skiing. That's how warm it was this weekend. Almost 70 degrees this weekend, this early in March. This is crazy. We don't get 70 degrees on opening day of baseball up here. And not only were they water skiing down the Mississippi, they were barefooting down the Mississippi. Well, not all of them. I did talk to one guy who I saw strapping on his dry suit, and I asked him, I said, hey, you going to be barefooting too? And he said, no, not since a couple of years ago when I hit a chunk of ice that was submerged just under the water. He said, that hurt. I'm not doing that again. But that's what it's been like lately. Super warm, and everybody's going a little bit crazy. Which brings me to the first of two stories that I wanted to highlight to you at coasttocoastam.com. In the news box, there's a story about two dogs that escaped from their electronic fence, spent some time adventuring. We don't know exactly what they were doing. They were covered in mud, scrapes, and hungry when they showed up, letting themselves into their local pet food shop. Now, I've mentioned this place, Chuck and Don's Pet Food Outlet, before because they're the ones that carried my children's books, which we did as a fundraiser. And it was just also, though, because the guy who posted the story on 5 Eyewitness News here in the Twin Cities is a coastie, a guy named Joe Mason, and he loves Coast to Coast. So I kind of asked if they put it up on the website, just if nothing else, to a guy who always listens to Coast to Coast and George Norrie and all of the rest of us. But it is a fun story to watch, how these two dogs escaped and then went shopping for dog food. They knew where to go to get some treats. And even though it was a long hike, they showed up at the store. And the video was there of them, like, hemming and hawing a little bit outside the store before they decided to let themselves in. You see it there. And then, so there, too, is also a story about werewolves, which will be informative, coming up next hour. And the story about the Phoenix Lights, the return of the Phoenix Lights, just days before the 15th anniversary of one of the major displays of unexplained light phenomenon over the city of Phoenix, Arizona. There was another odd, inexplicable flash of light, this time on live television. Here's the audio from one of the TV stories about this mysterious flash of light, which ran, and you can see more of that story on the website. But go ahead, Nathan, just run the audio from that.
Trying to figure out what caused that flash in the sky in the Northwest Valley. It happened this morning, right here. If you haven't seen it, here we go. During Andrea's traffic report, look, we're going to slow it down for you right there. Look in the background. Looks like some kind of very bright light, almost like it was an explosion or something. Our first thought was maybe a transformer. But we checked with APS and SRP. They said they haven't had any trouble. We haven't had any reports of any explosions either. Here it is, one more time for you in slow-mo. So it is still a mystery.
And you can see more of that story if you go to coasttocoastam.com. You can link up to that coverage, and you can see that light for yourself. It's a bright flash of light. It looks sort of like a bomb going off in the dark horizon in Phoenix. And it's not like the other lights, although there have been other reportings recently of triangle-shaped or chevron-shaped lights over one of the suburbs of Phoenix, and that story seems to come at the same time as the anniversary of the original Phoenix Lights as well. We'll talk more about that with Dr. Lynn Katai coming up a little bit later on. But first, let's try to eliminate what that flash of light couldn't be, and that's why we bring in Dr. Sky himself, Steve Cates, on Coast to Coast. Good to talk to you again, Dr. Sky.
Well, good to talk to you, Ian. It's been a long time, and good morning to you and all the Coast listeners.
Well, you are one of our first thoughts on this because we see a flash of light like that on that video, which, again, people can find at coasttocoastam.com. Just go to that Phoenix Light story. And the first thing is, okay, must be some sort of transformer. It looks like it could almost be an explosion from a gas tank or something that it would be easy enough to trace. Is there any way it could be a meteorological phenomenon? And I don't know enough about lightning strikes or anything else that could account for something like that naturally.
Well, I've been scratching my head, along with talking to a lot of experts, and particularly those in the meteorological field. And the particular story is that there's no major bad weather systems at the time that this KSAZ Fox 10 Channel 10 news report with Andrea Robinson was on. So I think we might be safe to say, and very accurate here on Coast, that it's probably not a weather phenomenon. And naturally, when folks do look at that video, it almost reminds me, Ian, of the beginning of the Iraq War, when we saw those big powder bombs coming down with these massive explosions. So having talked to people in the area, nobody recounts or recalls any large, explosive sounds in the area. So again, I'm just saying that it's probably not, and as you're asking me, any known meteorological phenomenon. But something very interesting, and this is another thing that I discounted. We do not live in the Phoenix area in a very active geologic area. But it's interesting as we come to the first anniversary of the Japanese earthquake.
Right.
Many stories were purported about bright flashes like this in and around the area of Japan just before this major earthquake, reminiscent of either methane gas emanations from the earth, but I don't think it's that either here in Phoenix. A very strange phenomenon indeed.
Well, no, I think that I want to explore that because that's the kind of natural explanation we either need to highlight or we need to dispose of in pursuit of what it could be. That you're suggesting maybe, a brief crack in the earth, some expulsion of methane gas that gets ignited. That would explain why it didn't make a loud boom. It would have just made perhaps a very loud flashing whoosh, almost like the sound of an amplified magician's trick, right?
Very well said. And another thing, even more in a realistic sense, some are saying that in the general direction of where the amplification camera, and by the way, folks need to know that the camera that they're seeing, I'm not specifically knowledgeable about the exact camera, but it looks to me and other knowledgeable people that this is some sort of like a night vision camera that instantly illuminates even the car headlights. They look much brighter than normal. So even though this does look like a large explosion, theoretically, in that area, we don't know. Is there a sewage treatment plant that had a release of methane gas, and that's the simple explanation? Or, going to your hypothesis, again, that it could be something yet unknown in the methane gas area.
Right.
And also, this is something else, Ian, that I've talked to some other folks saying, now with the preponderance of these handheld lasers, being that this is a high-intensified camera, we don't know. Maybe somebody had hydraulic green lasers and it just scanned across. But it really doesn't look like that to me either.
It doesn't look like that to me, and you would have thought that if it was that, there would have been something that preceded it and then followed it in the flash, whereas it just looks like really the signature, as you mentioned before, about the kind of video we were getting from the start of the Iraq War when those bombs were going off the background. That's exactly what it looks like, and yet no boom, no reported explosion, nothing that any of the police authorities were able to track down at any level. But then let me ask you another thing. As a meteorologist, and again, we're talking with Steve Cates, Dr. Sky, about the Phoenix Lights updated story that's at coasttocoastam.com for people who are just tuning in. Is it possible that something like that could show up on a radar, a ground radar, one of the Doppler radars? Is there any way that could be measured outside of a camera from any of the existing, 24/7 measuring devices that meteorologists would use?
I think that's highly probable, and I'm still talking to some folks that are in that field that are trying to go and get deeper into this. But again, I think the most important thing that we can pass on to the Coast audience is, in making this very unusual and very strange, Ian, is that there were no known bad weather systems in that area at that exact moment. Now, that lends to the thing we were talking about before. If all is calm, the atmosphere is tranquil, there's nothing behind us on the horizon, or on the horizon. But the interesting part about this, as you notice, this is to me, watching it over and over, a ground-up event. It's not something as if it darts across the sky, as many or anything that we would consider a UFO, meaning anything unidentified, moving through the sky. It simply goes back to the whole concept of being some sort of explosion. And again, I'm not too sure at this point to tell the audience. We always want to be honest with everyone out there. But we're still continuing to investigate this. And I find it so amazing. Of all the newscasts that are out there all throughout the world, this is one that's unusual. And again, as we're hopefully going to be talking about the Phoenix Lights 15th anniversary, wow, Ian, Phoenix, of course, the understatement of the century, the mecca of all strange sightings, and continuing over this weekend also. People calling my hotline saying, hey, Dr. Scott, we saw some lights in the southwestern sky.
Oh, really?
And I want to mention very quickly, I know time may be very limited, but in those particular cases, I want people to know very clearly, one of the hypotheses that I brought about, and I think many people agree today, again, going back to the 15th anniversary of the Phoenix Lights, the earlier events about the 8:15 and 8:45 events were the events that happened to the southwest behind the Estrella Mountains. In many people's opinion, still might be the flares, these LUU-2 illumination flares that known A-10s were dropping. But that's still an active area, that Barry Goldwater test range. And I think a lot of explanations, because I get a lot of phone calls on this, as you would imagine, Ian, here in the local market, on a clear night here in Phoenix with the no pollution or a dark sky, you can see maybe 80 to 100 miles out across the desert, as the bird would fly.
Sure.
And what I'm saying is that area of the sky, that's probably, and I can't get anybody to call me back from the Air Force bases on this to confirm it, but the truth of the matter is, I think, in my opinion, many of those sightings are probably explainable, but the second part of the Phoenix Lights, with seeing, of course, this massive object coming over Phoenix, I agree very much with your next guest and know her very well and respect her, Dr. Lynn Kitai, about the strange phenomenon that occurred with this craft of unknown origin that sailed across the now sixth largest city in America. Amazing stuff.
Well, and thank you for that. And we'll talk with Dr. Lynn coming up in just a second. But before we move on from this, I thought you said something earlier, and I kind of wanted to amplify it a little bit too. And that's this was a Fox story. So this is one affiliate, one local news station got this video. So the fact that the other TV stations, whether they are or aren't reporting it in Phoenix, that may be pretty typical. This would be a proprietary story, so they would end up having to promote. If they're going to report the story, they have to promote another newscast, and they're less inclined to do that unless something like, a governor was shot or something. They just generally don't do that kind of thing. But what surprised me, and I haven't been able to determine anything, and I just want to ask in any of the conversations you've had, whether you've heard it, if an explosion like this goes off in the background, would that not cause an alarm with local Homeland Security? Would they not have scrambled a jet, a helicopter? Is there any record for any of those nearby military bases that they took action after this was seen on live television?
Well, you bring up a very good point, and I'll be very honest again with the audience. I do not know that. And
that's
talking to some people, I've kind of asked the same kind of question, but do not have any calls back on that because I'm not a government official, just a person who's a journalist in the media who's obviously trying to find out answers. And as you know, as a fellow journalist, many, many times, no matter how hard we call, we still do not get a call back. But that doesn't mean that we're going to stop investigating this. I would imagine that smarter people are out there on scene or looking in that area and things that we may never know. But
they should, and this is the concern. If they know that there's nothing to this, they ought to throw a wet blanket over it and say, look, here's what happened. Just so you know, it's been fun to talk about it, but here's what really happened and explain it. If they don't have an explanation, they ought to not stonewall and just make it seem like they don't want to embarrass themselves by saying we don't know what it was. They ought to be more forthcoming and say, we didn't respond. We didn't send a helicopter. We didn't fly over. We didn't know where to send anybody to. And just be human about it and see whether or not that either helps or hurts in a further explanation of the story. So that's what I want to hear more of.
A long time ago, I saw something with my own brother back in 1997. I described it as a twisted pair. We were driving from Phoenix to Vegas, and in a small town, a very dark area of Arizona called Wickiup, we both witnessed a bright flash coming from the ground up, a blue, what I describe as a twisted pair, looking like a big giant DNA strand. And to me and my brother, nobody's ever explained that. So then again, we're seeing these bright flashes in the state of Arizona, totally inexplicable at this point in time, but we'll continue to keep the Coast audience updated on this because it is a very important subject. And Ian, also, as you know, this is a great week to look at the sky for the great conjunction of planets that we have and all the other great things. Not only Arizona, but the entire coast audience gets to see, back to the astronomy side, so many wonderful things in the sky this week. And pay attention to the sun, folks, because of all the powerful flares that we're getting. It's amazing.
That's right. And that was a question that some people had, whether this was connected to that, but it doesn't appear so. We're getting a lot of northern lights, by the way, up here in Minnesota, too. So just a little further north of the city, a little easier to see. But it's been exciting because of all of that activity. Well, thank you, Dr. Sky, for bringing us up to date. We go from Steve Cates to Dr. Lynn Kitai, who I think it was like 2-3 years ago, we had a conversation about this very same thing. The mystery lights over Phoenix. In this case, it's a mystery flash. And you can go see it by clicking on to coasttocoastam.com. Tell you what we'll do. We'll roll the numbers coming up next because I see a lot of phone activity. So we'll take a couple of calls on this. Maybe you've got, a really good question or an observation for Dr. Lynn Kitai, too, about the Phoenix Lights flash on the 15th anniversary coming up next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. I want to read you a little bit from Monsters in America. Before we get back to the discussion of the Phoenix Lights, we'll take some calls with Dr. Lynn Kitai coming up in just a second. These are the words of Scott Poole, who writes, Americans have an undeniable taste for the monstrous in all its forms, a taste in evidence from the time of the earliest colonial settlements. The narrative of American history can be read as a tale of monsters slain and monsters beloved. Witches and other night creatures infested the New England woods, and the devil inspired savage servants to combat the Puritans. Demonic rites and horrible shapes from beyond the grave lived in the shadows of the southern plantation household. Sea serpents trawled the waters of the oceans where whalers and slave ships knit the new country into a world of commerce. Wild men and savage beasts prowled the virgin woodlands where America cut its railroads and canals, built its settlements, and created a market revolution. After the Civil War, the American obsessions with race and violence became the bloody cords of memory that held the Union together, a union that in the 20th century combined an idealistic rhetoric of democracy with the crassest of imperial endeavors. After World War II, terrifying visitors from other worlds came to tell this new imperium of its doom, while murderous maniacs hunted its citizens relentlessly on the highways, in the forests, and even at summer camp. Monsters in America are everywhere and come in every genus and species. We'll get back to that coming up next hour on Coast to Coast. I think you'll find it a very interesting discussion of what is and what isn't a monster. What are real monsters? What are the monsters we create, and why do we need them? That's next hour. Been tweeting about that a lot. Love to do it at Deacon Punnett. Later on this week, I'm also going to send out a photo of something that I've been involved with. I'll just tell you a quick word on it, and then we'll get back to the phones and the conversation about the Phoenix Lights. On Wednesday, we're trying to have a night without hunger. It's one of those things that some churches across the country are doing, one night with your local food shelf. So if you support a local food shelf, be aware of the effort coming up on March 14th, a night without hunger. If you're inclined to make a contribution to a food shelf, that's a good time to do it so that the food shelves are stocked. If, we can't end world hunger, each and any of us want to perhaps, but we probably can't in our lifetime. But we can do is have one night without hunger. And if you are in touch with a local food shelf, if you're involved, just be mindful about the coming 14th. If you've never done it before, I think you'll find it enjoyable. My parish did a ton of tuna. That's what we are taking contributions for, a ton of tuna. We're right about, as I understand it, we're somewhere in the area between 3,000 and 4,000 cans now. We have to get to 6,000 cans if we're going to do an official ton. But, ton is just kind of a general term, too. So as close as we can get to 6,000 cans, that would be great. And I'll be sending out that photo coming up later on this week if you want to follow me at Twitter. Be good to keep in touch with you in the time that we have on the air. And Dr. Lynn Kitai, with whom we like to stay in touch. On the new Phoenix Lights mystery, we put up the photo of the explosion that happened just a few days ago. We're following up next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. I really enjoyed my conversation many years ago. In fact, I don't know, how many years ago was it, Dr. Lynn, that we last had you on, or at least I last had you on Coast to Coast?
Right. It was a couple years ago. It's such a pleasure to visit with you again. And I had just come out with the new version, the latest edition, the third edition of my book, and the Phoenix Lights, A Skeptic's Discovery That We Are Not Alone. And we had a wonderful conversation. And just as an aside, your next hour, you're talking about monsters and all that. I'm going to be talking with George Norrie on Tuesday night, our 15th anniversary day, March 13th. And it's interesting to note, and we're going to get into that more, I'm sure, that there has not been one report in 15 years of harm, threat, or abduction associated with the Phoenix Lights. If anything, it was quite the contrary, and that's fascinating in and of itself. But
I agree.
New event is also very serendipitous, I have to tell you.
Well, let's take a second then to highlight then Tuesday on with George Norrie on the 15th anniversary, talking more about the Phoenix Lights. And thank you for giving us a little time to both promote that and then also to explore this. As we see in this video, which we've linked up at coasttocoastam.com. In fact, Nathan, want to run it again just a little bit for people. This is the anchor going back over the lights story from just the other day on Coast to Coast. Go ahead, Nathan.
Trying to figure out what caused that flash in the sky in the Northwest Valley. It happened this morning, right here. If you haven't seen it, here we go. During Andrea's traffic report, look, we're going to slow it down for you right there.
And you can see very clearly this flash on the horizon comes up very bright and very big. Did you see it, Dr. Lynn, from where you were?
I didn't see it from where I was, but I did see it on the news. And interestingly, a couple of things. Most anomalies, of course, can be explained, and there's a prosaic explanation, and certainly you have to be prudent and cautious and critical and discerning when you see anything that's strange, particularly strange lights. But what's interesting this weekend, in fact today, we just had a big celebration at the Scottsdale Harkenshay Cinema for the 15th anniversary, and the news media has just been outstanding. I mean, they really have been very supportive in taking this topic very seriously, and I happened to be on the morning show, the Fox 10 morning show yesterday, and also this afternoon they did an interview at the event, and I asked them quite frankly, and actually yesterday we called around while I was there, and SRP and the other
power agency, utility.
Yes. Utilities say absolutely it had nothing to do with them, that it wasn't a transformer or any kind of an explosion. As Dr. Sky mentioned, we ruled out weather or something astronomical or
and earthquakes. The flash that comes before earthquakes, that also got addressed. There was no seismic activity afterward.
Right. I mean, they have, and actually, Fox actually called Luke Air Force Base, and they had no explanation either. So we're left with really a question. What was it? And ironically, and it's just probably a coincidence, but it's interesting that right before, actually it was April 21st, 2008. I don't know if you recall, there was another anomalous sighting of orb formations in the northwest sky. The very next morning, our documentary, which is one of our dozen International Film Festival awards, the Phoenix Lights documentary, was being released by Vanguard Cinema, and that still has a questionable explanation. So that was very ironic, and here we're looking at the 15th anniversary just a few days after this one. So, I don't know if there's any connection at all, but it is an interesting coincidence. And also today, which I think your listeners will find very interesting, we had Navajo Rangers that have now joined forces with MUFON, Mutual UFO Network. These are fellows that have a huge background in law enforcement, and they've had many, many incidents of strange anomalies on the Navajo range, that all over the world. They've had them as well, but certainly on the Navajo range that they're now sharing with the public and with MUFON, and they're actually with a case. January 21st, Saturday evening at 7:15, a very interesting case that's still ongoing in Chinle, which is the heart of the Navajo Nation, where two women, a mother and a daughter, were driving their car down a dirt road. This is a very isolated area, an open range with no houses, and they saw a row of white lights like pearls together, about 100 yards long, and suddenly, I mean, this is it sounds unbelievable, but this is their story, and according to the Navajo Rangers, they're very credible people. Suddenly it rose 3 stories like a building, and in their own words, they quoted it looked like a city with windows, white, orange flashes of light. Then the lights went out, and suddenly there was a huge flash, similar to what we just saw in the traffic report. And they actually saw, with this flash, a dome-shaped black craft. And the mother wanted to get out of drive towards it, and the daughter was a little freaked out, so they sped away. And actually, the daughter tried to take a picture of it. Their camera's battery was charged, but went dead. And then after the sighting disappeared, the camera went back on. So that's, it's very interesting that they told the story today.
Right.
That sounds
of all
very
times.
similar.
Again, if you want to link up to Dr. Lynn Kitai, you can by going to coasttocoastam.com. It'll take you to her website, and there, too, you can also find out about the new expanded edition of the book on the Phoenix Lights. I have some people in the Phoenix area who want to join in the conversation on the phone, but before I do, let me just ask you then, because this is different than the Phoenix Lights. I mean, the idea of this explosion in the horizon soundlessly, apparently, but something big that makes at least a booming flash of light, even if it didn't make the sound of a boom. That this may not be connected to Phoenix Lights, but if it is, in what way do you see these two things connected?
As I said, only in timing as far as that goes, because as far as the descriptions, and we're talking, on March 13th, for anybody out there that's not familiar with what happened here, and by the way, the Navajo Rangers also revealed today that there was another sighting the day before the mass sighting up in the Navajo Nation of these orbs that were circling counterclockwise, and the whole town actually got out of turned off their lights of their homes, went outside, got in lawn chairs, and watched this show for about a half an hour. So there were things going on, and I was documenting strange anomalous lights for weeks before as well. But on March 13th, we're talking many events happening throughout the state.
Sure.
Orb formations, these balls of light in rock-solid, mile-wide V formations, where even the air traffic controllers at Sky Harbor International Airport described them as balls of light, points of light that seemed to be attached to something, but they couldn't quite see what it was attached to, like there was a force field between them and people underneath it when it actually glided right over people's heads, about rooftop level, and they would see that there was something in between these orbs that was blocking out the stars. Other people actually saw craft, and there were multiple craft throughout the state for many, many hours. We're not talking 1 or 2 events, but many events for many hours, and we'll talk more about that on Tuesday. But if they want to get to, if anyone wants to get on the website, thephoenixlights.net, and look at the photo page, I have a unique collection of photographs of these anomalies.
I bet you do.
But also the GAP page, GAP, very interesting, 12-year compilation of hundreds of reports to the National UFO Reporting Center in Seattle, Washington, Arizona MUFON, Village Labs, which was a clearinghouse here, computer lab, during the mass sighting and after, as well as the Councilwoman, former Vice Mayor Frances Barr, which she received 1,000 reports. And you can see 8 or 9 different crafts that people actually noted. So there were many events going on, and very different from this flash, as you say. But, then again, the Navajo Rangers said that these flashes have been happening up in their reservation.
First time caller line, Derek is in Chandler, Arizona, on Coast to Coast. Dr. Lynn Kitai. Hey, Derek.
Hi, how's it going, Ian? Dr.
Good.
Kitai,
Did you see the lights by any chance yourself?
I did, actually. I watched it was actually on YouTube. I didn't catch it live, but I was in the area, and it's kind of interesting because I track solar activity as far as like CMEs, coronal mass ejections, things like that. Mm-hmm. And what I think, to me, I used to live in California, and occasionally during earthquakes, they would have transformers explode. And that's what it looked like. And I know that one of the things you guys fell back on was the utilities companies saying that there wasn't any activity. I believe what they may be doing is kind of shadowing the fact that their networks and grids are subject to that solar flare activity, because it would create, undue panic, in my opinion. And, as a result, they're covering that up. And I think it was a transformer, and I don't think that that's really a coincidence.
Well, there have been transformers that have, exploded, or there's been problems with them, and they have reported them. But, I'm open.
Yeah.
In fact, Fox has asked the public they've asked an inquiry for the public to get back to them if they know anything. And so far, no one has come forward with any kind of reasonable, logical explanation.
And as a public utility, I don't know that they wouldn't be, and I think state to state it may change, but they would be breaking the law in some states if they withheld information like that, because of that, the unique arrangement that they have licensed with the public. They have to be much more forthcoming. They can't be like another corporation, which might be able to bury something like that that's unflattering or potentially scary. West of the Rockies, Justin is also just south of Phoenix on Coast to Coast for Dr. Lynn Kitai. Justin?
Hi. Hello, how's it going?
Great, thank you.
Oh, doing good. Hey, I'm from Phoenix, born and raised here, and I remember the Phoenix Lights when I was a child. I remember seeing them and talking about them with my dad and listening to Art Bell talk about them. So this is a wonderful, it's almost a reliving of the same thing for us. And I didn't get to see these ones. However, hearing the news stories the next day totally fascinated me. And I remembered back when I went into the Navy, and I was one of the fellow Navy men who was going to boot camp with me on the airplane. He was a Navajo guy. Mm. He was born and raised on the Navajo Nation, never had been outside of the reservation. He and I started talking right away. Of course, I was fascinated with his culture and upbringing, and we formed a friendship. And through training, he and I talked a lot, and I asked him about the Northern Lights, and he looked at me straight ahead and said, "Oh, those are our visitors from
the
heaven."
Phoenix Lights. You mean the Phoenix Lights? Yeah.
Yes. The first ones. He said those are our visitors from heaven. He said those were our chiefs told us, and they passed down for centuries. He says we know exactly what those are. Those have been with us forever. And he told me a little more about his heritage. He has Hopi blood with him, and he said that part of the tradition being passed down is that Hopis believe that we, here in the state of Arizona, we are a hotbed for visitors from heaven. We have clear skies most of the time. There's very little rain, very little clouds. They can come here, and the humidity is such that it's very appropriate for their equipment to work in low humidity areas. Also, with the Grand Canyon, it's a great place to hide a spaceship for a day or two if you need to come out and do some study or reconnaissance out in the desert.
Okay.
And
interesting.
Talking with him throughout my Navy career, I learned a whole lot about what Native Americans believe is extraterrestrial activity associated with the first Phoenix Lights.
Right. Well, okay, go ahead. The question.
Can I interject a little something?
Yep, well, we're going to run out of time here, though, too, so go ahead.
Okay, that's a great statement, because not only do the Hopi have protocols to invite these intelligences in, but very interestingly, if you look at the photo page on the Phoenix Lights Network, and in science we look for repeatability, you'll see that the orbs, these anomalies that I document on 35 millimeter, keep popping up where South Mountain and the Estrella Mountain Range intersect, and in between those two mountain ranges is a basin where the Gila River Indian Reservation is. And they had invited me to present my substance abuse prevention education program 6 months before the mass sighting, and I called them after the mass sighting to say, these pictures keep showing that these things are popping up right in that area. Did you see anything on March 13th, strange lights? And they started to giggle, and I said, is that funny? And they said, are you kidding? We've been looking up at them for centuries. We call them sky people, light beings. It's part of their culture. It was the first time that I ever heard of that. And when I started looking into it, not only do they call the estrellas, meaning star in Spanish, by the way, the gateway to the stars. They believe that there's a gateway or a portal in that area, which is just fascinating when you really look into the indigenous cultures and their belief for centuries that there are other intelligences out there that they welcome and they actually invite them because they believe that they come to give them inspiration and motivation and comfort.
Well, there you go. And it's just as I feared we were out of time there, Justin. So sorry we could never get to your question, but long preamble, and I hope that Dr. Kitai's observations there validate what you were experiencing. So thank you for that. And thank you, Dr. Lynn. Again, coming up then this Tuesday night on Coast to Coast with George Norrie, and we'll be visiting the 15th anniversary subject once more in a longer appropriate form on the way later on this week on Coast to Coast. Thank you so much for squeezing us in. And again, you can link up to Dr. Lynn Kitai at coasttocoastam.com. Have a great night. Thank you. And coming up next, the monster terrifies because it represents the terrifying fate of our own bodies. All of the creatures of folklore and popular culture raise unanswered questions about the bodies we inhabit. We're going to talk about the monsters that are real, the monsters that aren't, the things that we make into monsters and why. Monsters in America coming up next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Well, we are replete with doctors tonight, aren't we? On Coast to Coast. As you heard last hour on Coast to Coast, we had Dr. Sky on, Steve Cates, talking about the meteorological possibilities that would explain that recent flash that happened in the horizon sky of Phoenix. And then we had Dr. Lynn Kitai. She's a medical doctor who resides in Phoenix, who was originally very much a skeptic about the Phoenix lights until having witnessed them herself, exploring them, trying to dismiss them, and has written one of the definitive books on them, coming up on the 15th anniversary of that. And now Dr. W. Scott Poole, who is a man who grew up, as his bio says, in love with monsters, like most of us, but now he's a tenured professor of American history at the College of Charleston, South Carolina. He teaches pop culture classes and also talks and writes about monsters in America, our historical obsession with the hideous and the haunting. These are my favorite kind of books because we don't just deal in fact here, but we pursue truth, as we will in the show tonight. And tonight, we'll be talking about the marginalized, or as he writes here, the marginalized are the monstrous, and the monstrous is marginalized. The monster, more than our fears, also represents our hatreds. Whatever makes us lose our lunch, whether natural or supernatural, can be defined as a monster. The monster is the sickening other. Well, I'd like to start this conversation with where we left it off on what Dr. Lynn Kitai said about the Phoenix lights and what Dr. Poole himself might have to say about that kind of alien invasion. It's one of the chapters in the book, Monsters in America. We'll get started next. On Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. I learned many new things in Monsters in America, our historical obsession with the hideous and the haunting. Good work, Scott Poole.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed writing the book, and I'm really looking forward to talking about it with you for a while tonight.
Good. Well, quite a while. Thank you for...
we've had a long time together, I understand.
This probably isn't the usual 10-minute radio hit you're used to doing. But also part of this because I've read, I think, right up until the chapter on the undead in America, and I look forward to finishing the book later on. But I'm very interested in both some of the themes and then some of the new concepts even that I think you're pushing, and I really want to get to that. But before we do, let's go back a little bit.
Yep.
And I know that you talk about the concept of the alien invasion and what that meant to us from the 50s and the 60s in the book. But here you have an unusual circumstance, and I just like your reflection on it in any way that it hits you.
Okay.
that, here in the city of Phoenix, they have had 3 separate major citywide contacts with lights that have come in, been fairly orchestrated. One person claimed that they had done this, but I don't believe that person was ever able to reproduce that on demand. There's video. There are thousands of people who have seen things which cannot be explained by some of those things that were offered. And then just recently, this mysterious explosion that happened in the early morning in Phoenix, which nobody can track. Nobody can find out where the explosion happened, where the big ball of light is from, and we linked it up. But what, as somebody who is both a historian and somebody who thinks about monsters and somebody who thinks about our relationship to these types of subjects, what do you see or hear in that ongoing story that piques your curiosity or confirms some of your other theories?
Well, I have been reading about this for the past few days, and, like a lot of sightings of all kinds of, prodigies and extraordinary phenomenon through history. And, hopefully we'll kind of go back and talk about how even the Puritans were seeing things.
Oh, yeah.
It's difficult to explain exactly what they were. But what interests me about it ultimately is what these stories mean, what is at stake in the kinds of stories that we tell about phenomenon that we can't explain. Obviously the world is full of those kinds of phenomenon, and to some degree, I think that we see and that we find what we've been culturally conditioned to see and find. So whenever there's these kind of discussions, there's this kind of automatic split between, okay, we've got the skeptics on one side that are going to, try to give us some kind of empirical explanation for what's going on, and then the believers on the other. And I don't ever think that it's quite that simple, in the sense that as a historian, I'm really most interested in, what sort of counts as knowledge, what counts as verifiable. And what does these sort of events mean to people?
Well,
I don't, and in the book itself, as makes this in a way sort of extraordinary claim at the beginning that monsters are real, that academics ought to take monsters seriously. And what I mean by that is not necessarily that monsters have some kind of ontological reality, something we could test in a test tube or put on a table in a lab, but rather they're real in the way that every kind of social construction is real. Take something like democracy. You can't put that in a test tube either. But it certainly has reality, and it certainly has real-world effects in the material structures of society.
All right, now, as somebody's going to be like your worst nightmare of a student, I want to go back to what you said, and I'm going to try to pull it apart a little bit, because I'm curious about what you said there in regard to the Phoenix Lights.
Right.
In light of what I've read in your book, is that I think the question here is, when you talk about, I think the door is open for skeptics to be able to say, aha, here's how it is. This is what happened. I think that if skeptics could step up and explain, here's the explosion, this is where this came from, or these are where all these lights came from. I think there's a large percentage of the people that right now would fall into the believer category, that would switch over to the skeptic category and go, aha, quickly. It was nothing. But the fact that vacuum exists, there isn't anything that explains it. There isn't anything that comes in and says, this is all that it was, and nobody can replicate it. Nobody's been able to explain the depth and the breadth and the repetition of it. That is what leads to people going, well, until I hear otherwise, I'm going to believe what my eyes tell me.
Right.
And I accept what you're saying about cultural predisposition to believing one way or another. But I think there's a lot of people who are inclined to not believe that there are, for example, UFOs flying overhead every minute, who, when they see something like that, say, until you can explain to me that that's not a UFO, I'm going to go with what my eyes say. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that has been part of a much larger discussion in American history about the nature of science. I actually discussed some of this in the book in relation to the American obsession with the sea serpent in the 19th century, which is, as you know from the book, really centered on this debate between our eyewitness reports. Again, what I've seen with my own eyes, is that good enough? And there were actually very many in the scientific community early in the 19th century that said, sure. A scientific mind like Charles Lyell, the famous geologist, he was a big believer in the reality of sea serpents, in part because he had collected all of these eyewitness accounts.
Right.
This actually became a part of the professionalization of science, where science and where the scientific community felt like it could stake out its claims. And one of the things that they decided after several embarrassing incidents where a number of local scientific societies had gotten behind the belief in the sea serpent, only to have it proved wrong. So they staked out the ground on eyewitness accounts are not good enough. We have to have something that's reproducible. We have to have something that we can experiment on in a lab. And until we have that, it is not incumbent on us to believe. And I think that's really sort of the difference there. I mean, you're suggesting rightly, I think, that, for many people it's sort of, I need you to show me why this isn't true. And right. I think kind of what comes at this from the other side, the more scientific worldview is, I need you to show me why it is.
But I think the interesting part of that is either one. And we're talking about monsters in America, and I know that this inevitably intersects many different ways with religious upbringing.
Absolutely. I think this is actually sort of the beginning of sort of the conflict between religion and science.
But I think that part of that is it demands a leap of faith for science as well. And I think that's kind of the claim here, I think, for something like the Phoenix Lights or other phenomenon, is what science wants, and I'm not anti-science at all. I love science, and I'm fascinated with what science can and can't do. But science wants the same leap of faith that religion gets. And what it says is, although we can't prove it yet, trust us, someday we will prove that this isn't true, which is just as much of a faith statement as, say, the Nicene Creed is. Mm-hmm. It asks for you to say, okay, I'm going to trust that you will and that whether science does or doesn't is immaterial. And sometimes, often, the scientists are proven wrong. I give you, for example, on the sea serpent conversation, which we should be more specific about, there was a period of time, and why don't you explain a little bit more here,
Sure.
A time when sea serpents were popping up everywhere in the American news landscape.
Every lake community, every whaling ship, it seemed, was seeing a sea serpent. And not just American science for a while, but American pop culture was fascinated with it. I mean, it really kind of became, I say in the book, it really kind of became the monster of the 19th century.
And yet, what we also know is that in some respects, perhaps, some of the explanations of sea monsters might turn out to be encounters with giant squids, which had, up until a certain point, not actually physically been discovered yet, except they were being witnessed, they were being seen by, by seamen or the sailors were encountering them where they really were attacking boats. And they were seeing this and they were reporting it, and they couldn't necessarily be taken seriously because they had no physical proof of it.
Well, I think that's true. I think it is important to note, though, that, early on, you really before sort of the professionalization of science and, the whole idea of kind of peer-reviewed research and the connection of science to the modern university and that kind of thing, that there was something more like what you described in terms of science asking a leap of faith to be made. I think that in the case of, say, one example that I came across was the Boston Linnaean Society.
Explain that, if you would.
Well, the Boston Linnaean Society, of course, it was named after Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish taxonomist. He was very famous for sort of creating this conceptual filing cabinet of the world, really. Genus, species, those sorts of terms and categories come to us from him. And this New England Society was convinced, its membership, and it's actually, I should add, it's very respectable membership. I mean, some of the more important natural scientists in New England were involved in this. They were sure in about 1818 that they had discovered the spawn of a sea serpent. It was about a 3-foot-long snake that had some very strange markings that they could not identify with anything that they knew. And the society really more or less staked their reputation on this find. And unfortunately for them, Louis Agassiz, who is this very famous Harvard natural scientist, essentially proved that it was a common New England water snake that had some sort of skin disease, and that kind of accounted for the markings. And the Linnaean Society was gone by 1821. I mean, just a few years later. I think some public embarrassments like that, combined with the inability to produce a specimen in the way that was later possible for the giant squid, for example. Right. That really led to this split that you're talking about between a popular culture and a folk culture that was fascinated with these kinds of creatures and that took eyewitness accounts very, very seriously, and a scientific community that thought, these claims were very ambiguous and a little amorphous. And again, until we've got the specimen in a lab, we cannot say that they exist.
Well, and that's kind of the beauty of this discussion we'll be getting more into too, is sometimes, the strongest arguments against the belief in something get loudest just before they're proven to be true. So, and I only bring up the giant squid just because I think it's interesting that in light of all of the years and all of the samples and all of the underwater photography, it wasn't until 2004 that a giant squid was actually photographed in its natural habitat. I mean, that's extraordinary to think in the timeline of history that it took that long. And I think that the same may be true eventually for other monsters in America, perhaps, if we look at them that way, like Bigfoot. But before we go any further into that, let me ask you to define monster, because I think that already we could talk about the monstrous size of natural things, or we can talk about monsters in terms of the things that scare us, that exist in the shadows that we can't see except with our imaginations. How do you define monsters for monsters in America?
Actually in the book I start out by saying that I'm not going to define monsters, which I think has driven some academic reviewers of the book pretty crazy, because academics always like to have, sharp, straightforward definitions of things.
But then you do.
Well, I do in the sense that I think a historian defines any kind of reality. The reason I say I'm not going to give an abstract definition of the monster is that the monster has been different, and its meaning has been different in different periods of history. If I could go back to my example of the concept of democracy, it's hard to give an abstract definition of that, because it meant something very different in 5th century Athens than it does in 21st century America. And so, it's really important, I think, to examine monsters in their historical context. The fact of the matter is, the things that scare us change. The things that make us uneasy about the world change. We're talking about alien sightings here. That was not a monster in America before the 1940s. Really before 1947. And it's also the case that, anybody that you talk with horror films about will say that, when they look back at the horror films of the 1930s and the classical Universal Studios monsters, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, one of the first things people say today is, that they're just not very scary. They're not particularly frightening. But people in the 1930s were scared of them. And my sense is that that's because monsters are products of the context that they come out of. And so it's hard to say the monster is always this. Sometimes it's the thing with 1,000 eyes. Sometimes it's the serial killer. Sometimes it's the sea serpent. And it all depends on the historical context.
You know, I think what's true is that if we went back in time and we looked at the monsters of past generations, today's generation would not be scared. But if we took today's monsters and we went backward, we would scare the living bejesus out of every person on the planet. If we showed them the movie Saw in the 1938, can you imagine what the impact that would have had? And it's so, our monsters today, to make your point, reflect a very different place where we are culturally, but we'll get into that coming up next. Monsters in America, our historical obsession with the hideous and the haunting. There's a lot to get to here, and I do want to pick up that conversation then about Bigfoot and about some of the other monsters, beings that were once considered monstrous, which are now thought of in a different context. We don't talk about Bigfoot as being a monster anymore. And I want to offer a working definition that I have of monsters to Scott Poole, and we'll see if that doesn't inform the conversation too coming up. Also, thank you everybody who's responding on Twitter, getting a kick out of your live reactions. You're always welcome to stay in touch that way. At Deacon Punnett is my Twitter account, and I tweeted out earlier, tell me about your monsters and I'll tell you who you are. That's the subject here. Monsters in America. We'll learn about that coming up next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Learning about the history of America through the eyes of our monsters. Monsters in America. Well, more on that coming up on Coast to Coast. And also then later on this week, if you missed it in the first hour, it's always worth going back and grabbing it through the Coast Insider. We talked a little bit about the Phoenix Lights, I guess we could say it 2.012. The latest version of that was this mysterious explosion that happened the other day, and that conversation will continue coming up this Tuesday night with George Norrie on Coast to Coast. But back to Monsters in America, picking it up with Bigfoot and maybe some of the earliest monsters in America that you never heard of, that were just as real as our monsters are today. And who are our monsters today? Are they much more real than we like to think of them? But have they taken the place in our hearts and minds where there used to be boogeymen? Coming up next on Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. So, Dr. Scott Poole, Monsters in America is the book. The early settlers, the early colonialists, as you argue, came here from other countries. They had European monsters as their backdrop, but found new monsters in America, things that scared them like crazy, things that they were convinced they saw, things that might in fact in some form have been there. It's just through their lens they saw them differently. What are some of the earliest examples of monsters in America?
Well, in many ways, the first monsters that Europeans believed that they were encountering were the Native Americans. And they had sort of been informed by that belief through sort of this long-running tradition, this idea that actually goes all the way back to Homer and to Pliny and to others, who had written about these monstrous races that lived in other parts of the globe, monstrous races that were sort of out beyond where the maps ended. And this had long been an expectation on the part of many Europeans that, once they broke out not only into the New World, but also into Africa, that they would discover all kinds of monstrous beings. And so they were sort of prepared for that in a way when they encountered Native American people. This was in part related to the idea, which became very common in Europe during the early modern period, that the New World was essentially full of cannibals. Now, cannibalism actually is ethnographically is a pretty rare phenomenon. When it does occur, it usually occurs in sort of ritual-type circumstances, like we know with the Mexica, the Aztecs. But Europeans were absolutely convinced that the entire New World was filled with cannibalistic peoples. And so a lot of the early representations that the English, that the Spanish, that the Dutch were looking at of what they were expecting to see when they got here really involved a monstrous vision of the New World, and that carried over pretty directly into the early treatment of Native Americans. You see that in particular, I think, with the Puritan treatment of the Native Americans, who people who were never really interested in converting the people that they found here, but really wanted to wipe them out.
Right.
Really pursued a sort of a genocidal policy against many of the Indians in what's today New England.
Well, you talk about an incident, I have to say, I'd never heard of. Mm-hmm. Although I guess it was not uncommon. It was, I hate to think it's as relevant as this news story from over the weekend where this soldier in Afghanistan went rogue, was apparently, he's accused of being drunk and maybe having some mental issues, and went and murdered all of these innocent Afghans, basically sleeping in their beds. And this
possibly a group of soldiers. I think it's actually not clear yet.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, I'd heard just about the one. But regardless, the fact that this happened, I was reading your book while I was watching that news story, and in the book, you talk about how, at one point, some of the early, settlers went on a murderous rampage and just killed everybody in a village, just almost seemingly out of some kind of mental snap, where they just were trying to eliminate their fear by going into these villages and killing everybody. It sounded like the My Lai massacre.
Yeah, I don't know if I would characterize it as a mental snap, and the reason I say that is, this was part of the Pequot War, at least one of the incidents that I talk about in the 1630s. It was carried out by Puritan militia. And the Puritans, as we know, we know them, I guess, most folks know them mainly through the witch trials. And they had this real sense that they were surrounded by satanic powers on every side. And the native peoples represented that to them, witches represented that to them, even various kinds of natural phenomenon. Black bears, they were convinced were diabolical creatures of some kind. And so I think that kind of their mental habit, their frame of mind, was that they were confronting satanic enemies when they confronted the Pequot and the Narragansett and some of these other native peoples. So yeah, I think you're referring to this incident along this native village along the Mystic River, near Long Island Sound, actually, where they essentially just sort of go in and wipe out everything that moved, and wrote about it afterwards. This is not something anybody was ashamed of. A very famous New England historian, William Bradford, recorded this and said things like, as they burned, as they fried in the fire, and the streams of their blood were quenching the fire, it was like a sweet sacrifice to God. So this was not seen as a shameful episode. It was kind of their understanding of the covenant people at war with the demonic.
Well, and I think this, you'll understand when I say that period was development of psychology, so we have nobody there to mark that. If the past is prologue, sometimes we look at what goes on today, and we can also reflect backward too and say, when people snap, they snap, and they may be very proud of the fact of what they did. That may also cover for the fact that there's a secret shame, that they know that something's wrong that they did, and so they become boastful about it, because it helps the bluster helps cover up whatever they may actually have been feeling about how wrong it was to do what they did. But maybe I'm just cutting them too much of a break. And I
understand what you're saying. There is this tendency to obviously to reframe horrific acts and either rationalize them or justify them. that happens again and again in discussions of America's 20th century foreign policy in many ways. But, I think it is important to know that, you have Puritan leaders like Cotton Mather who really develop a whole mythology of the Native American peoples, where he says, these are people who are the children of Satan. That's a term that he uses. The reason that they are here in the New World is that the devil lured them here so that they would not come in contact with the gospel. And so they are a completely benighted people. So benighted, in fact, that genocide, not a word he used, but it's right. How we would describe it, is really the only
justifiable.
War to the knife to the hilt, as they put it in those days. So yeah, I don't know how much guilt that the Puritan consciousness had about this. They believed they were destroying monsters.
And yet there's also a thread that starts sometime after that with beings in the woods that we still have to this day. And I think Bigfoot is a good example of that. At one point, we look at the images of Bigfoot and the descriptions of Bigfoot, and they are very monstrous. They talk about Bigfoot as being, almost a demonic beast that was going through and looking to grab children, and were, and that these tribes of Bigfoot were had been organized and were the enemy. And now we don't think of Bigfoot that way. And in fact, in many states have passed laws, even just theoretically, suggesting that if you ever encountered a Bigfoot, it would be against the law to kill one.
Right.
And that's a long way from where Bigfoot started. In a way, what we see is the evolution of something like a Bigfoot, whatever Bigfoot is, away from being considered a monster.
Right. Well, I would say though about that pre-1950s, which of course it's late 1950s, that you have kind of the classical formulation of the Bigfoot myth. Before that time, it's really hard to find a creature or a set of creatures that are identifiable as what becomes Bigfoot. I think that what happens after the sightings in the Pacific Northwest in the late 50s is that you have kind of a constructed tradition where, you look back and you see these sightings in the early part of the 20th century, the sightings of the wild children in Puget Sound and on some of the islands off of the Pacific Northwest, and then that gets connected to Native American mythology, some of which I guess sounds like a little bit like the wild man of the forest and that kind of thing. But I'm not sure that before the 1950s there's a really strong tradition of that creature. I think that you are right, though, that in the late 20th century, we have this idea of kind of these Pacific cryptids, these peace-loving cryptids who don't really do any harm. We actually have this regional cryptid known as the lizard man in Lee County, South Carolina. And I visited Lee County last summer and was really struck by the fact in a lot of my conversations with the locals that they were very concerned to tell me that the lizard man never attacked anybody. He attacks their cars, it turns out, but he doesn't attack individuals, and also that he's a vegetarian. They really wanted to impress that fact on me, that this is not a sort of a horrific, ferocious kind of monster. And I wonder, actually, if, and this is really just sort of off the top of my head, it's not something I've fully developed, but I wonder if maybe as in modern America, there's kind of this more of a sense that there are fewer enchanted places. There are sort of fewer dark forests. If we're sort of creating happier monsters, at least the monsters of folklore, than was experienced at one time.
This may be a point of disagreement between us, but I'm not sure I'm I'm willing to use the word folklore as casually when it comes to Bigfoot. And I say that because I've had on the show a couple of times, and I know other people have too, Dr. Jeff Meldrum, who is an academic who's been studying Bigfoot, and as a biologist, as a zoologist, he's convinced that there is something there. It's not, to him, it's not he thinks the folklore is built around it, much like at one time folklore had been built around giant apes. And it was presumed until the beginning part of the 20th century that there really weren't giant apes.
Right.
And that it was just part of the imagination, the native imagination. And then it's proven that they are, and now they're a protected endangered species, and we have them in zoos. So I guess I'm not willing to disconnect the stories of the wild men or the hairy men, or more specifically, the stories, the Native American stories. And I think you're very culturally sensitive, and I can see your effort on doing that in the book. But I fear that if we look at it and we just say, well, that's those Sasquatch legends, that's a different thing. It's not a different thing to them. And so to them, I think they see the continuity between Bigfoot and Sasquatch, and they see the stories of the wild men or the giants, right? That was the hairy giants that existed in the woods. They see those things as one and the same.
Although the they that you're referring to are not obviously Native Americans who first created and circulated those stories in connection with their own larger mythological systems. They are, more recent contemporary people who are making connections between the media sensation, which it was of the sightings of Bigfoot and all that went along with that, and earlier kinds of tales. And so, to me, regardless of the whole discussion of what kinds of empirical evidence we have for these sorts of creatures, that still exists as folklore. Folklore doesn't necessarily mean it's not true, just like the term myth doesn't mean it's a fraud. And that's actually a very important point to me in the book, is that the existence of monsters has to be taken seriously by historians because people believe in them. Their lives have been informed by them. I mean, our previous discussion about this massacre on the Mystic River, that was an actual happening, and that was an actual happening that was informed by a set of beliefs.
Right.
And so while it is not, I don't think, incumbent on any of us to believe something that there is not empirical evidence for, I do think it's incumbent upon serious scholars to take those kinds of stories seriously and to take them at face value.
Well, and I'll contrast that with the conversation we had again in the first hour about these most recent lights over Phoenix, or in the backdrop of Phoenix anyway, in this most recent case, is that there was an aspect to that which was being discussed from the perspective of the local Native American groups, and there's a couple of them outside of Phoenix, and to them, this is completely consistent with the stories that they've been passing down for generations. So there is in a way, there's sort of no news here, because this is always what they've seen. They've always experienced these lights. And if that has been going down, if that has been passed along for generations before the Phoenix lights 15 years ago, it almost doesn't matter whether it goes back 5 generations or 15 generations. It goes back at a time that predates the appearance of the Phoenix lights, but at the same time seems to inform them. It explains them in a way which is culturally different than what many of the rest of us are coming at it from a rationalistic mainstream viewpoint.
Right. And actually that's an important part of this discussion, is that, often with Bigfoot, with the question of flying saucers and extraterrestrials, with the sea serpent as well, there's often, even among believers of those things, there's often this kind of fuzzy line between the rationalist believers and those who want to see these things as phenomenon of the supernatural.
Right.
So, for example, with the sea serpent, you did have in the 19th century a scientific discourse that surrounded it. You also had people claiming, well, what is actually being seen is Leviathan, this creature from the Bible.
Right.
And sometimes those two seemingly very disparate discourses, kind of crunched up against one another. I think you see that kind of in the kind of the Bigfoot community today as well, because, as you and your listeners know, I mean, there's a good bit of dissension between those who would take the more cryptozoological view. These are animals that we have not discovered yet. Once we discover them, they will then fit into this larger rational framework that we have of the world. And then on the other side, those who see Bigfoot as a kind of a spiritual sign, as a kind of a portent and an omen, maybe the remnants of an older, wiser race that has something to teach us. And the same kinds of discussions happen with extraterrestrials. What I see as a kind of a historian and somebody looking at our culture in that is that people are bringing a lot of different narratives to unexplained phenomenon and fitting those phenomenon into those narratives.
I totally see that, and I think that's a fair point. I